I'd been putting it off, but it was finally time to clean out my garage. So on February 10th, 2012, I rolled my wheelchair out into the garage and began cleaning up the pile that had been accumulating over the many years of my life. As I kept moving junk, I noticed the Beetle Light footlocker that I hadn't seen for years. It was still collecting dust and spiderwebs over in the corner under the window. It was an old, dirty military storage box that all of us kids were issued to keep our stuff in. It had been so many years that I had almost forgotten I still had it. Back in the 1980s, I journaled everything that happened to me during this time, and stored the journals in this footlocker. It was my job to draw illustrations and write descriptions of my experiences, as well as what my teammates told me their experiences were, and put them down in these journals. I rolled my wheelchair over to the footlocker, unlocked it, and opened the top of it. A puff of dust flew up in the air as the lid of the chest fell back. I could clearly see the neatly stacked journals were still as I had left them over 30 years ago. When I looked inside, I had forgotten how many of these I had done. Back when I had written these journals, it was a very scary time for our country. There was a Cold War going on between the United States and the Soviet Union, which is now Russia. These journals were top secret and could not be shown to anyone outside the government at the time. But now that Russia was no longer an enemy, they had been declassified and I was free to share them with anyone. It's strange for me to think that so much of my life was wrapped up in this little green beetle, which was the firefly symbol representing Beetle Light. So these are the journals of my life and the lives of my friends during that time. This all started when I was a 12-year-old boy in a small eastern coastal town in the United States, with an old Indian name called Lightning Bow. This is the next journal of the sequence, and is an account of my first mission. This is Beetle Light Journal number 3, the Submarine Rescue. Beetle Light Journal number 3, the Submarine Rescue. Chapter 1. Let me catch you up. So this is my third journal. This is where things are going to get really interesting. Let me catch you up on what happened in Journal 2. My name is Chris Richards, and I had been recruited by this secret organization called Beetle Light. I had a security pass that got me into the Beetle Light complex. It was a converted, abandoned rock quarry pit that the government bought for this project. It was covered by a giant geodesic glass dome, and inside was a forest to protect some special fireflies that we have here in our town of Lightning Bow. This was the cover story for the special operations that were really going on inside, run by the Department of the Defense. I was about to be asked to join this undercover operation to rescue a Russian scientist from the Soviet Navy. The public story about this huge guarded complex was that the Department of the Interior was trying to protect our special species of firefly that live here in our little town of Lightning Bow. When I went into the Beetle Light complex, I could see that it was the size of a football stadium and was split in half. Half of it was the forest for the firefly cover story that the public could see, and the other half was an aircraft hangar and training center for the undercover agents that were kids with disabilities training for special missions. These kids were special agents working for the government. When I came into this complex, they called it Beetletown. I met a military man in a wheelchair that was running the whole operation. His name was Major Santos. I was overwhelmed by everything I was seeing and just listening to him as he was catching me up on where all this had come from and why. So back to his story. While healing from his injuries at the Briarwood Rehabilitation Center, Major Santos witnessed these special kids successfully pull off a night raid on Rodney Bass, the town bully. Rodney was trying to kill the fireflies in a jar, which is against the law in our town of Lightning Bow. You can read about it in Journal 2, the night raid. The early Beetle Light agents were on a mission to photograph Rodney in the act of smashing the fireflies. This night raid was pulled off by Ted Johnson, Jillian Raintree, and Justice Reed. Rodney found out who these kids were that got him in trouble with the sheriff by photographing him in the act of trying to kill the fireflies. Rodney knew they were from the Briarwood Rehabilitation Center. He was going to get even with them and was waiting for his chance to find them alone after school someday. After Major Santos saw these kids in action, he got an idea and called Washington to get in touch with his commander. His commander had been trying to figure out a way to get back into the Soviet submarine base. It was located on the island of Cuba, where Dr. Boris Steingart, the Russian scientist, was held captive. Boris had helped build the Soviet Navy submarine fleet and was ready to defect from the Soviet Navy to the side of the United States. Boris was ready to share all the secrets of the Soviet submarine fleet with the United States Navy, so it was very important to help him escape. During an earlier failed escape attempt, a mean Russian guard named Vlad Korsk had ordered a shore gun to shoot and blow up Boris's wife and daughter in a tiny boat as they were trying to escape. Dr. Steingart watched as the shore gun fired at his wife and daughter's boat and blew it up right in front of his eyes. Vlad laughed and warned the same thing could happen to Boris if he tried to escape again. After Vlad had killed Boris's wife, Dr. Steingart had no loyalty to the Soviet Navy at all and wanted to help the U.S. fleet by giving them all Soviet naval secrets. Boris was so sad and was destroyed inside at what he had just seen. His wife and daughter were gone forever. What Dr. Boris Steingart didn't know was the U.S. Navy SEALs had safely gotten Boris's wife and daughter off the tiny boat and safely onto the United States submarine before the boat was blown up by Vlad and his guards. They were safe and free, but Boris didn't know this. Boris was still sad about what he had seen from shore the night he saw his wife's boat was blown up, and was waiting for his chance to escape from the Soviet Navy, which was stationed in Cuba. Major Santos had failed to rescue Boris Steingart the night of the escape attempt by falling through the rusty pipes in the refinery leading to the submarine base. This left him paralyzed from the waist down. Major Santos wanted to go back to Cuba and try to rescue Boris again, so he put together a new plan and wanted to use the kids at the Briarwood Rehabilitation Center because he saw they had talent to pull off the Cuban mission where he had failed. The kids he saw successfully catch the bully Rodney Bass, killing fireflies, were Justice Reed, who was a double amputee, Jillian Raintree, who had lost one leg and was paralyzed from a plane crash that had killed her father, and Ted Johnson, who had Down syndrome. Major Santos knew these kids also had the perfect cover story of being disabled and would never be suspected of being secret agents. Major Santos noticed while he was healing at Briarwood that almost every kid and Special Olympics athlete at the training center, although they had a disability, had compensated in some way for that disability and had developed a special talent or two. After seeing the successful Beetle Light night raid that Justice, Jillian, and Ted had pulled off, Major Santos thought he could use the special talents of these kids for undercover operations. He could also use the cover of their disability to hide the identity as secret agents from the Soviets holding Boris. No one would ever suspect that a kid with a disability could be a special agent working for the U.S. government. It was the perfect Trojan horse mission. So even today, when you see someone with a disability, you really won't know if they're really working undercover as an agent for a secret organization like Beetle Light or not. You might know a secret agent right now and never have realized it. I just sat there in the Beetletown aircraft hangar, listening to Major Santos tell the story of how Beetle Light came to be, and the night raid the kids had accomplished, which gave him the idea for all of this. I thought it was all so cool and wanted to be part of it. Then he said, once I got the idea, I went out and recruited certain kids that were training at Briarwood for their special talents. They had to have a disability to be chosen for this project as cover for the mission they were going to be asked to do. He looked at me and pointed to all the kids in the hangar and said, they all have different talents. Some kids are hearing impaired and can read lips, while sitting across a room in a cafe and tell us what the bad guys are saying at another table. Major Santos went on to say that some kids like Jeff over there, who has muscular dystrophy, are very smart and think strategically. He can put undercover plans together. Some kids are amputees and can hide remote-controlled vehicles or crossbows in secret compartments in their arms and legs. Other kids have high-tech communications equipment inside their chairs, which can send information to satellites. Some have wheelchairs that can turn into off-road hand cycles. Pointing at my wheel racer, he said, some kids like you, Chris, can invent high-speed vehicles that you are very good at driving, which allow you to get away from trouble fast. Major Santos said some kids like Ted over there that have Down syndrome are champion athletes and can throw the javelin in the Special Olympics farther than anyone. He can also row in the sculling competitions, and as you know, he's also a great photographer. We are lucky to have him in Beetle Light. People don't know what kids with Down syndrome are capable of, which makes Ted one of our best undercover agents. Then Major Santos looked straight at me and said, "Which brings me to you, Chris." He told me that he had heard about my racing down Monument Hill in our town and beating everyone on bicycles with my newly designed wheel racer. The fact that I was also an inventor would come in handy with the new mission everyone was getting ready for. Inside I was kind of excited, but I didn't know what I was in for, so I felt a little nervous too. Major Santos motioned to one of his assistants to go get someone. His assistant was wearing a white lab coat and brought Ted, Justice, and Jillian back over to where we were talking. After listening to the story of how these guys went on a night raid to catch Rodney Bass, who I knew to be a very scary kid, I kind of felt like I was in the presence of heroes, at least to me. Major Santos looked at everyone and pointed at me and then said, "Everybody, this is Chris Richards. We've been watching him for some time now. He will be part of our Cuban rescue mission and will be working with Jillian." I looked over to Jillian, and she kind of looked serious as she was sizing me up as if to say, "I wonder if this kid is up to this mission." She and everybody had been planning this for some time now, and I was the new kid and would have to earn my way onto the team by not messing up. Major Santos went on to say, "All of you will make up the team for this mission, and we are going to rescue this important Soviet scientist from the Russian submarine navy." Major Santos was holding up a picture of Dr. Boris Steingart. He went on to say that Dr. Steingart thinks his wife and daughter were killed trying to get to freedom in the last escape attempt. What he doesn't know is that some of our Navy SEALs got them off the boat he saw blown up the night we tried to get him out of Cuba the last time. If we can get him out, he will be very surprised to find them alive and waiting for him on our rescue submarine. Major Santos held up another picture. This time it was a picture of Vlad Korsk. He told us that this guard is the one we really have to watch out for. If he catches you on this mission, you might be shot or put in one of their labor prison camps, where we would never be seen or heard from again. He asked if we understood. Everyone said yes. He went on to say, "This mission is critical to our submarine navy, or we would never ask you to do this. Dr. Steingart has all the codes, secrets, and submarine designs of the Soviet fleet, and his information would be invaluable to the United States." Chapter 2. Laying out the mission. Major Santos laid out a huge map of the operation on a table in front of us and started talking about our different roles. This is the new Beetle Light operation, nothing like your night raid on Rodney. It is the real thing, and we will be doing a lot of training between now and the mission, he explained. Major Santos said the Russian submarine that Dr. Steingart was being held in is here, as he pointed at the map of Cuba on the table. He said it's tied up at a dock in a port called Cienfuegos, on the island of Cuba in the Caribbean. Major Santos looked at all of us and went on to say, "We have arranged to have a Special Olympic event between our kids at Briarwood and the Special Olympic kids of Cuba as a goodwill gesture. The Special Olympic Center is located right next to the submarine base and refinery. This will be your cover story. You will all compete along with others here from Briarwood that don't know you are members of the Beetle Light organization. When you are not competing in the competition, Ted, Jillian, Justice, and you, Chris, if you will do it, will help rescue Dr. Steingart and reunite him with his wife and daughter on a U.S. submarine which will be waiting offshore. As I said, Dr. Steingart does not know his wife and daughter are still alive. If we are successful, it should be quite a reunion for them." Major Santos looked directly at me and asked, "Chris, will you help your country and join our team? We need this Russian scientist to tell us what's going on with their submarine technology so we can stay ahead of their development." I looked at everybody else standing around the table, who I knew were going to do it because they had been training for over a year now. Major Santos said one more thing. "Before you answer, you must be aware There's a lot of danger. If you're caught, you could be shot or sent to a Soviet prison. As I said before, if this wasn't important, we would not ask you to do this. Are you in?" I said that yes, I was in, but that he was going to have to convince my parents. I remember thinking, I never thought anyone would ever ask me to do something this important. Major Santos explained why the SEAL team needed someone my size to do this. The fact that I was an inventor and a wheelchair racer would soon make complete sense for this plan to work. No one but a kid my size that knew how to race a wheelchair could fit into where I was going to have to go for this mission to be successful, and to have to do the things I was going to have to do. The fact that I was disabled would hopefully cover our trail in this adventure, if everything worked according to plan. Plans, by the way, never go off the way you expect, which I was about to find out firsthand. Chapter 3. Here's what you all have to do. Pointing to the map, Major Santos started with the sequence of what we all had to do. He looked at Jillian and me and said, "We would parachute out of a military plane with special hand cycles into the jungle area near the mouth of the cave system. The cave would lead to a mine and directly to the refinery near the submarine base, by way of conveyor belts in the mine. We were to enter the cave, which would lead us to an underground mine where they used to mine metal ore out of the ground. The Cubans used the conveyor belts to get the ore in the mine to the refinery to melt it down into bricks for transport on the ships. This was before the Soviets turned it into a submarine base. Our mission was to go through the cave leading to the mine inside the mountain and get on the conveyor belt that would take us to the control room of the refinery. Ted took these pictures of the map for all of us to study, so I'm including them here in my journal. Luckily, the mine and refinery weren't operating anymore. A lever to an underwater intake gate leading to the submarine security area was in the old refinery control room and had to be turned to the on position. This was used for letting in seawater to cool off the giant smelting ore vats, which melted the ore mined in the mountain. The giant ore vats are like giant pots to melt metal at extremely high temperatures. If this intake gate were open, then it would allow Justice, who would be wearing scuba gear, to swim through the intake pipe and into the secured submarine area underwater to rescue Dr. Steingart from the submarine that he was being held captive in. Meanwhile, Ted and his friend Bert were to carry a boat from the boathouse with a collapsed-down hang glider hiding inside a long duffel bag, and carry it over to the old guard tower in the abandoned cement factory, which was right next to the refinery. Ted was to carry the hang glider to the roof, reassemble it, and have it waiting for Jillian and my escape after we opened the underwater security gate lever in the control room. This would leave the underwater security gate open for Justice to swim in and out of, hopefully taking Dr. Steingart out with him. Back in 1984, Russian submarines were using the refinery and cement port when they were in port at Cuba, which was an ally of the Soviet Union. This was a submarine base called Cienfuegos. On the far end of the Cuban island was the United States naval base called Guantanamo Bay. Major Santos said the plane we would jump out of would take off from this U.S. naval base and drop Jillian and me at the mouth of the cave that would lead us to the mine. Everyone had his or her orders. Then Major Santos looked at me and said, "Chris, you need to learn how to fly a glider. Your instructor is waiting for you out in the hangar now, so you best get started." So I went out, and the adventure began for me. He continued on and said, "You all still have a lot of training to do for your different roles in this mission. The Special Olympics in Cuba are a few months away, so let's get to it." And with that, everyone went back to work, and my adventure began. Chapter 4. The main Beetle Light mission begins. 6 months later, the entire team landed in Cuba, and half the team went directly to the Cuban Special Olympics Center, where the competition would start the next day. Ted and his friend Bert entered their different rowing events down at the Olympic boathouse. While they were waiting for their part of the mission to begin, they practiced their upcoming rowing event. As part of Justice's cover story, he only competed in events of wheelchair racing, and even though he had specially made legs and feet for running, he kept them off and hidden until he needed them for the Beetle Light mission. It was important for the mission that the authorities in Cuba thought Justice couldn't run or swim, so he kept his artificial legs off when the officials were around, and only used his racing wheelchair. There were a lot of other kids in the competition from Briarwood, but none of them knew the four of us were secret agents of Beetle Light. I had been working out and getting stronger for the mission. I had gained 10 pounds before the mission and was stronger than I had ever been in my life. My clothes didn't even fit me anymore. Major Santos worked all of us really hard for the past 6 months. We all knew how hard the Navy SEALs had to really train, so none of us whined about what we had to do. Jillian and I did not go with the team to the Olympic Center. We were flown with our specially designed hand cycles and parachutes directly to Guantanamo Bay Military Base, which was located on the end of the island of Cuba. We would follow the plan, and if we were successful, would meet back up with the Beetle Light team. They would be in the U.S. team workout room at the Cuban Olympic Center after we had completed our mission. After getting our gear together and getting one more briefing, Jillian and I took off from Guantanamo Bay at the end of the Cuban island in a huge gray military transport plane as the sun went down. It was dark outside, so no one could see the plane. We were flying over deep jungle terrain in the mountain areas of Cuba, where no one would see or hear the plane. Jillian and I had practiced being rolled off the back of the plane in our modified four-wheeled hand cycles many times. It was cool, but it was a little scary being rolled off the back of a flying plane with a parachute that you hoped would open and could support the extra weight of us and our hand cycles. I was a little nervous doing it for real this time. We had parachutes attached to the backs of our hand cycles and were ready for the giant door of the plane to open. It finally did. It got really windy inside the plane as the door opened. An Air Force officer came over and put his hand on my shoulder and yelled in my ear because it was so noisy with all the wind in the plane as we were flying. "Are you ready, son?" I said, "I think so." And some crewmen rolled Jillian and I off the back platform of the plane and into the black sky. As I was falling before my parachute opened, I was upside down for a second and was glad I was strapped into my hand cycle. Jillian's parachute had already opened, and she was coming down smoothly and controlled. My chute finally opened, and I slowed down, flipped right side up, and stabilized out next to her. Looking down, all I could see was black jungle. I was thinking, I hope the pilot knew that this was the right location to drop us off at. There were 2 cords coming down from our chutes, and you could pull one or the other to direct where you wanted to land. We had night vision goggles on, so we could see a little clearing near the landing point and aim for that landing zone. I was a little off, and Jillian, as usual, hit it dead on. Sometimes she was annoying, but I would soon be glad she was so precise with things. After we landed, we cut our parachutes off our hand cycles and pulled out our compasses to see which way the mouth of the cave was. The jungle all around us was thick, but there was an animal trail that headed right for the cave entrance. We could hear lots of tropical birds screeching in the dark jungle, which were all around us. It was nothing like back home in Lightning Bow. There were no fireflies anywhere. I began to wonder what kind of animal made this path leading to the cave. I didn't want to say anything in front of Jillian, so I kept my thoughts to myself. We grabbed the hand cycle pedals and started pedaling toward the cave. The hand cycles were designed for rough trail riding over rough terrain and could go almost anywhere in low gear. The sun had gone down just before we parachuted in, and thousands of bats were streaming out of the cave to feed on the insects flying in the night. All of a sudden, I wasn't so hot on going into the cave, and I looked behind me expecting Jillian to be freaking out about all these bats flying around us. I was hoping we could wait until they had finished flying out so we could go in. To my surprise, she ran right into the back of my hand cycle because I had stopped to see where she was. She looked at me and just said, "They're bats. No big deal. Don't be such a wimp. Keep moving." I didn't say a word because I didn't want to show her I wasn't a big fan of bats, so I kept moving forward into the mouth of the cave. Now, one thing I didn't mention about Jillian Raintree is that she's Native American Indian and very in tune with nature, and stuff like this doesn't bother her in the least. Me, on the other hand, I'm not so hot on bats flying over my head. I was worried that they were going to bite me in the neck. I didn't want her to think I was a wimp, so I kept moving forward toward the mouth of the cave anyway. Just as I turned around to start moving forward, I heard a hiss, and something on the wall of the cave entrance lunged at my head and hit the front of my night vision goggles. It was a snake, coiled around a vine, holding onto the wall. He struck at my head, but missed and hit my goggles instead, luckily. Venom from its fangs was dripping down the glass of my goggles in front of my eyes. I let out a loud "Whoa!" Then I backed off and said, "They didn't tell us about snakes back at the Beetletown training center." There were snakes all over the walls of the mouth of the cave. They were feeding on the bats as they flew past the snakes. The snakes were grabbing them out of the air as they were flying out of the cave to feed on the insects in the night sky. Jillian was getting frustrated with me and said, "Well, this is taking forever. We're not getting in there this way." She reached down to her artificial leg and pushed a button, and a small hidden door popped open on her leg, where she reached in a hidden compartment to grab a police baton. It was a black steel tube about 10 inches long. When she grabbed it, she whipped it out into the air, and it telescoped out into a 3-foot solid steel pole. Police departments use them all the time. Someone had to do something about these poisonous snakes, and Jillian knew just what to do. Jillian took a hard swipe at the snakes and went right over my head with her baton, knocking 2 of the snakes off the wall of the cave. This cleared a way for us to cycle in. I just turned to her and said, "Good job. What else do you have in your leg?" She said very seriously, "Everything we will need." With that, she collapsed the baton back down to 10 inches and put it back in her leg and closed the secret compartment. I was impressed with her performance, but I wasn't sure she liked me all that much. She seemed so serious about this mission. Chapter 5. The Bat Gallery. Now that the snake that had tried to bite me was off the wall, we could make our way into the dark cave. We had been ordered to have lights out until we were inside. No one could see in the cave, so we wouldn't be giving our positions away with the lights. It was now safe to take our night vision goggles off and turn our head and hand cycle lights on. The cave lit up to reveal these cool-looking stalactites and crystals hanging from the ceiling. We could see these clear pools of water below as we moved through the cave. The pools reflected the ceiling of the cave, so it looked like the stalactites grew up from the floor of the ponds inside the caves, as well as down from the ceiling. If I hadn't been on such a scary mission in a foreign country, I would have liked to have explored this cool cave. We were both a little scared about getting caught and failing our mission, so we just kept on moving forward to find the mine area of the cave. We continued to make our way through the cave to try to find where the mining operation started. Knowing where the mine was would lead us to the conveyor belt. We needed the conveyor belt to get to the control room of the refinery. We kept moving forward over rough terrain. I remember thinking that these off-road hand cycles were working pretty well. I thought they might be fun on trails back home, if we ever made it back home. We rolled into this huge cave room with very tall ceilings, and we heard a lot of high-pitched screeching. It was the main bat gallery of the cave where all the bats lived. I looked up and could see something moving on the ceiling. When I pointed my flashlight up, I could see thousands of bats hanging from it. They were all pushing and shoving each other, finding the best position on the ceiling. As we pedaled forward, something started smelling really bad. So I pointed my flashlight around the room and then down to the ground under where the bats were hanging, and saw a huge pile of bat guano, which is bat poop. It filled almost the entire floor of the bat gallery, including where our hand cycles were sitting. I heard Jillian say something, but I couldn't make out her words. Then I noticed that the bat guano pile was moving. Just then I felt something crawling on my stomach and back. I couldn't feel my legs, so I didn't notice them earlier, but now I noticed I had these bugs crawling all over me that had come from the pile of guano that my hand cycle was sitting in. They started to bite me up where I could feel them on my back and chest. Jillian had them all over her, too. They were carnivorous bugs, which means they eat meat. They lived in the bat guano and would eat anything that might fall from the ceiling the bats might bring home. They would also go after the baby bats that might lose their grip from the roof of the cave and fall to the floor below. It was clear they were now going after us. We had to get out of there. We knocked off as many as we could and then cycled forward up these rocks and out of the pile of the bat guano. I know some people pay a lot of money for bat guano because it's good fertilizer for plants. I just wanted to get away from it because it smelled really bad and the bugs would eat you if you stayed there too long. When we were safe up on the rocks above the gallery floor, I reached over and knocked some of the carnivorous bugs that were biting Jillian off her back, that she couldn't get off herself. She said thanks and smiled a little. Jillian was a very serious person and a real competitor in archery. I think that's why she was so good. She would not take less than a gold medal when she was shooting in the Paralympics. I think this was the first time I ever saw her smile at me, and it was definitely the first time she thanked me for anything. She didn't have a problem with snakes or bats, but she hated bugs. I didn't care about bugs, so finally I could take care of a bug problem and feel like I was helping our mission a little. After getting all the bugs off, I looked at Jillian and asked, "Do we keep moving?" Jillian agreed, and we cycled forward into a narrow tunnel that looked like a mine shaft. I said, "We must be getting close. This looks like the beginnings of what we're looking for. I see a little light ahead." Chapter 6. First Objective, Conveyor Belt. As we came around a corner, we started seeing lights hanging from the sides of the mine walls. There was old rusty mining equipment all around us, like ore cars and other digging machinery. Finally we came to a post with a red button on it, which was our first objective, the on button for the conveyor belt. We were able to hand cycle up and onto the conveyor belt, but the red start button was about 15 feet away from us. Jillian reached down again to the plastic part of her leg and opened the secret compartment. She pulled out a small crossbow that I had seen her practicing with at the Beetle Light complex back home. It was collapsed, and she snapped it together and loaded the crossbow with a small arrow. Our orders were to get our hand cycles on the conveyor belt that was no longer operating, and once on the belt, Jillian was to shoot the red start button with her crossbow. She would start the conveyor belt machine, which would take us out of the mine and to the refinery area. She looked at me and said, "Are you ready?" I said I was, and she took careful aim at the red start button on the post through her scope and fired the crossbow arrow. She called it a bolt, but it looked like an arrow to me. It would be a difficult shot because the red button from 15 feet away was so small, but Jillian was one of the best archers in training for the Paralympics at Briarwood, and I knew she was going to hit it. She hit it dead on, as expected, and we heard something in the background that sounded like a jet engine, slowly starting up. I felt a rumble under my cycle. Just then the conveyor belt we were on took off with us on top of it. We started moving quickly through the mine, riding on top of this moving belt. It was made for conveying rock ore to the refinery. It was kind of like a ride at a theme park. We just weren't sure where it would take us exactly. More lights started turning on as we moved closer to the mine exit, so we shut our flashlights off, just in case someone saw the conveyor belt moving. We crouched down on the conveyor belt as we moved through the mine so as not to be seen, but someone from above us could look down and see us if we weren't careful. Our next objective was the first transfer. We moved into position and came to the end of this belt, which successfully dumped us onto another conveyor belt. This one took us outside the mine and above the refinery, where we could see hundreds of pipes tangled with all kinds of machinery. The moon was out and casting a lot more light than I was comfortable with. We ducked down because we were now exposed, and to our surprise, some of the refinery looked operational. It was all supposed to be shut down, but there were guards, soldiers, and security dogs everywhere. I suddenly thought, what did I get myself into here? Jillian had a similar look on her face. I would have bet she was thinking the same thing. Once the conveyor belt started moving us toward the refinery, we knew we were supposed to come to a tower high above the complex, where there was a pipe room. This pipe room had another red button on a post that Jillian had to shoot, but this time it would stop us so we could get off the conveyor belt. This pipe room was the reason we were chosen for this mission in the first place. Our orders were to enter the giant pipe in this room, which would take us and our hand cycles to the mission control center. Once in the control center, we would pull a lever to open the underwater security gate, which was protecting the submarines as they docked. If we missed stopping the conveyor belt and getting our hand cycles off into this pipe room, the mission would fail and we would ultimately be caught. Jillian would have to shoot the button again with her crossbow, but this time while we were moving. If she missed the shot, the conveyor belt would keep moving us past the pipe room and dump us into a giant vat of ore. When the refinery was operational, this vat would be heated to 3,632 degrees to melt the metal ore. Luckily, our spies at the facility said the refinery was no longer melting the ore, but it would still be a long drop. We might not die from the drop into this empty black pot, but it wouldn't be comfortable and we would be trapped there. Jillian had to make the shot. We were still outside above the refinery, on the way up to the tower, when we saw black smoke coming out of the foundry, where they melted the ore at the end of this conveyor belt. Straining to look ahead, we could see that the foundry was operational, and the black ore pot had been heated. It was full of molten metal ore. We were heading straight for it. Someone had gotten their intelligence wrong. This was really bad. Jillian understood how important this shot was. If she missed it, I don't think we could have gotten off the conveyor belt before we were dumped into the giant molten pot of ore. We were coming up on the pipe room with the red button. I leaned back out of Jillian's way so she had a clear shot at the stop button. Our conveyor belt angled up toward the pipe room. We were almost to the top of the building and were moving over rollers which were under the conveyor belt. It was bumping us around a lot. Jillian put an arrow, or a bolt, in her crossbow and got into position, so that when the red button came in front of her sights, she could fire. Just then, one of the rubber wheels that were under the conveyor belt jolted Jillian, knocking the arrow from the top of her crossbow. It bounced off the conveyor belt to the ground below. Looking down, I could see two dark, very scary-looking security dogs. They immediately went over and sniffed the arrow that had just fallen on the ground about 150 feet below us. They smelled Jillian on the arrow, and one of them looked up at where the arrow had come from. It pinpointed our position. Jillian and I were just about to enter the pipe room tower when both dogs took off to the stairs that would lead them up to us. Chapter 7. The Pipe Room. I felt the heat from the molten metal ore that was in this giant pot boiling ahead of us. We were getting closer. It was hot, and we would be dead in seconds if we were dumped into that pot. Jillian had to make this shot. She frantically opened her leg again and quickly grabbed another arrow. We were almost to the button. She lifted her crossbow, took aim, and fired. Jillian's arrow hit just to the edge of the red button, but it was enough to stop the conveyor belt. She put the crossbow back in her leg, and we got off the conveyor belt, very relieved. We rolled over to where the giant pipe was that would take us to the main control room. Once we made it to this pipe room, our orders were to roll our hand cycles into the mouth of the pipe. Here we would close the mouth of the pipe behind us. This pipe would then lead us to the lever in the main control room that we were to switch off. This would allow the underwater security gate to be opened and Justice to swim through. This is where Major Santos had failed in his mission before. The first problem was that he was too big for the pipe, and he had to crawl on the bottom part of the pipe. These were very old and rusty pipes, and the water had sat and rusted on the bottom of the pipes over time, making the bottom part very thin and brittle. While Major Santos had been crawling through the pipes, he broke through many places with his feet as he crawled to get closer to the control room. So now there were gaping holes in the bottom of the pipe, so no one could crawl through them again without falling through. The guards weren't concerned about anyone coming through because some of these holes were huge and would keep anyone from getting by them. Because of this, the guards weren't watching the pipes as carefully as they should. This gave us an advantage, if a way could be found to bypass the huge holes in the bottom of the pipes. This is where we came in. If you used a special four-wheeled hand cycle that was a little like my wheel racer, it could be done. The person needed to be small enough to fit on a hand cycle inside the pipe. The four wheels of the hand cycle would ride up on the sides of the rusty pipe, where it wasn't rusted through, and pass right over the top of the holes in the pipe. If you had experience with wheel racing, wheelchairs, or hand cycles, and were small, you could possibly make it all the way to the control room at high speed without the guards catching you, if you were lucky. It would be like a water ride at a theme park, if you didn't fall through the holes. Once in the control room, we could open the underwater security gate for Justice to get through. His orders were to swim through with his underwater scuba equipment. At least this was the idea. I was ready for this because of all my practice with my wheel racer on the hills back home in Lightning Bow. Jillian, however, was an archer, not a wheelchair racer. She had been practicing with downhill racers over the past year, but was not as confident as I was with this part of the mission. My orders, once in the control room, were to fix and rewire the electric motor that was disconnected in the control room. Once we got there, this motor powered another conveyor belt in the control room that would help us escape after we opened the security gate lever for justice. As we were maneuvering our hand cycles in the mouth of the large pipe, I heard something below us. The pipe room was high above the refinery, and what looked like a guard tower was stairs going all the way down to the ground below. There were 16 flights of stairs to get up to us. Below us we heard what sounded like a scratching and a light pounding on the stairs coming up our way. I suddenly got a chill because I knew what it was. I yelled at Jillian, "Jillian, the dogs have found your bolt on the ground below. They're coming up here for us. Hurry!" With all the noise, Jillian at first didn't understand what I was saying, but the sounds of the guard dogs were getting closer, and then I could tell by the look on her face that she got it. The security dogs were running up the stairs toward us, in the pipe room, as fast as they could. These were highly trained attack security dogs. They would tear you up and not ask questions. We had to get safely in the pipe before they came bursting through the open doorway to this tower room. I didn't know if we could get these two machines and ourselves into the pipe in time, but without the hand cycles, we wouldn't be able to get over the holes in the pipe and the mission was over. We had to maneuver the hand cycles into the pipe and quick. I was in the pipe, but Jillian had not gotten her hand cycle in yet and was having problem with her front left wheel. I moved forward to give her room in the pipe and put my brake on and leaned back to help her get her front wheel in. Jillian asked, "What's happening?" I looked her straight in the eye and said, "Jillian, when you lost your arrow over the conveyor belt, it fell to the ground. The security dogs have found it and have pinpointed our position. They're coming up the stairs below us right now. You're going to have to hurry." Jillian for the first time looked panicked and was not calm anymore. These dogs could at very least start barking and give away our position, and at the worst, kill us, which is what they were trained to do. We had to get Jillian's hand cycle in, but it was stuck and wouldn't move. Without the hand cycles, we would not be able to ride over the holes that were ahead of us, in the pipe. We had to get her cycle in and real fast, or we were dead. I could hear the dogs getting closer as they were running up the stairs toward us. I suddenly got an idea. As long as the dogs were in chase mode, they wouldn't bark and give us away to the guards below. But as soon as they got here to us in the tower, they would start barking and attack. The conveyor belt, which we just stopped, was very noisy, but was quiet now. If we could start it back up, it would cover the sound of the barking dogs when they got up here to the tower. Hopefully by then we'd be safely in the pipe with the pipe door closed. I told Jillian to lean back and hit the conveyor belt button again and start it. She pulled out the arrow that was embedded deeply in the button and pushed it again, and the conveyor belt started. It was very noisy. Then I went back and tried to get Jillian's front wheel in, and finally it moved into position, but the dogs were just one flight below us and coming fast. "Hurry, crank your hand cycle forward, Jillian, or we're dead," I screamed. She did, and it popped up into the pipe just in time. Just then the dogs burst in and lunged toward us while I was closing the door. As I swung the pipe door closed, my fingers were sticking out a little, and a black Doberman security dog attacked and bit my fingers, slicing two of them open. I was bleeding pretty good, and it hurt. These dogs were trained to kill and kill fast. They were barking loudly and clawing at the pipe door we had just closed. The conveyor belt, fortunately, was covering their sound for now. We didn't have anything to lock the pipe door shut with, but it would be pretty hard for the dogs to open the door. Jillian had some Band-Aids in a pouch attached to her hand cycle, and she pulled them out and bandaged up my fingers. I could barely see because there was just a crack of light shining through around the seam of the door. I could barely see Jillian as she fixed my finger. She said, "Thanks for not leaving me out there with those dogs." I said, "No problem. Remember what Major Santos said. We always take care of our own, and we leave no man behind." When we closed the pipe door, it was completely dark inside the pipe. We turned on our hand cycle lights again, and when I looked at Jillian, her eyes were wide open, as she was staring at my chest. She was not saying anything, as if she was trying to keep something from attacking me. I didn't know what was on me, but seeing the look on her face, I knew it wasn't good. I quietly and gently asked her, so not as to upset whatever it was that was on me, "What is it, Jillian?" She said, "Don't move. You have the biggest spider I've ever seen crawling up your shirt right now." I just sat there and whispered, "Get your baton out and knock it off. Hurry!" She reached into the secret compartment in her leg and pulled out the baton. She was carefully knocking the spider off my chest so it wouldn't bite me. This thing was so big and nasty looking. One bite and that was it for me. I remember wishing Jillian would hurry, but she was being careful not to make it mad as she carefully pushed it to the ground. Boy, was I glad when that thing was off me. I didn't feel anything, but I kept checking for bite marks. My shirt was clear of any blood or puncture holes. That was a close one. I remember as we rolled forward down the pipe to get away from the pipe entrance and the dogs barking, I felt a bump and heard a crunching sound. When I looked down at my back left wheel, I saw clearly that I had just rolled over and smashed the huge spider Jillian had just knocked off me. It was under my back wheel, making spider mush all over the inside of the pipe, and now Jillian, who was right behind me, would have to drive through the spider guts as she followed me down the pipe. I have to admit I didn't feel too bad for the spider, because it was dark in there and I didn't know where that spider was. But I did now. As I went forward, I yelled back to her, "Thanks, I guess we're even now." As we rolled down deeper into the pipe, the dog's barking sound became fainter and fainter as we got farther from the pipe door entrance. Chapter 8. Adventures in the Pipe. Finally, after the spider incident, we were making good time as we zoomed through the pipe like a tube at a water park. What took Major Santos hours to travel through on his hands and knees only took us seconds as our hand cycles gripped the sides of the pipe. We rolled up and down and all the twists and curves inside the pipe, and I was actually having fun for the first time. I looked back and Jillian was right behind me on her hand cycle. We were really moving fast through the pipe. I remember seeing light ahead as we turned a corner. I could see large holes in the bottom of the pipe that Major Santos must have made while crawling through here. It was pretty tight in here, and he was a big guy. It must have been very uncomfortable crawling on his hands and knees through all this rusty piping. As we came to the first holes in the pipe, I got concerned and slowed down a little. Our hand cycles were gripping the sides of the pipe as planned, as we went right over the holes he made in the bottom of the pipe with his feet. The holes Major Santos left in the pipe were the size of his feet and knees as they broke through the thin, rusty bottom of the pipe. They were getting larger and larger as we got closer to the control room. I could look down through the holes as we passed over them to see the ground far below us. As we kept moving over the holes, sometimes I could see ground and sometimes I could see ocean below, as the pipes went out over the ocean occasionally. This really was the best way to travel unseen through the refinery without the guards knowing we were here. This was a great idea, if we survived it. The next thing we came to was very eerie. As we came down a slope and leveled off, we arrived at a man-sized hole in the bottom of the pipe. This had been where Major Santos had fallen through, ending his mission and losing the use of his legs. I thought for a second about the sacrifice Major Santos had made for his country. Then I wondered what I had ever done for my country, or for anyone else before. All of a sudden I felt glad that I was small enough and knew how to ride a hand cycle for this mission. It put me in a special position to help this Soviet scientist escape, and help our Navy to better protect our country. It felt pretty good, and it was well worth the danger. I think Jillian felt the same way. We passed over Major Santos's hole in the pipe, and we came to a part in the pipe that was uphill, and we had to hand pedal up it hard. It had been an easy glide up until this point, but this was going to be much harder now. Sound carries very far inside a pipe, and we could hear far back down the pipe, where we had just come from, a slow screech, then faint barking. I thought, oh no, the dogs got the door open, and they're in the pipe. They were coming after us again. The barking was getting louder, and we were hand-pedaling slowly up this steep grade inside the pipe. I was hoping the holes in the pipe that we had gone over easily with the hand cycles would stop or slow down the dogs, but they must be jumping over them because I could hear them and they were coming closer and closer. I was almost to the top of the grade inside the pipe, and Jillian was right behind me, constantly looking over her shoulder for the dogs to come around the corner behind her. They were getting closer, and I finally got to the top of the bend in the pipe, but Jillian was still only halfway up. She looked up at me as she pedaled and said, "Why am I always in the back where I have to deal with these dogs?" I kept saying to her not to look back, just pedal. Then I remembered Major Santos's hole and how big it was, and told Jillian that the dogs would have a hard time getting around that big hole in the pipe, unless they could ride a hand cycle to get over them. I was trying to give her hope, but I knew these dogs were trained to go almost anywhere to catch people. I could tell it gave her a little hope that these dogs wouldn't be coming around the corner right now to take her head off at any second, but I knew they probably would be here soon. Jillian was almost to the top of the bend, up where I was, and the dogs did come around the corner, barking and growling at us. They started trying to get up the steep grade inside the pipe to the top of the bend where we were. Jillian finally crested the top and was up with me at the top of the bend. The dogs' toenails were having difficulty getting a foothold on the slippery pipe, and they kept sliding back a little as they were trying to get us at the crest of the pipe. They were very determined and making slow but steady progress getting up to us. We had to think of something to keep them from getting up to us, or they would be chasing us all the way to the control room. The conveyor belt there was not hooked up yet to cover the dogs' barking, and they would certainly give us away to the guards before we could finish our mission and escape. Chapter 9. Meanwhile, Ted, Bert, and the boat. A few hours earlier, Ted and Bert, who were scullers, which are boat rowers in the rowing competition, were at the boathouse in the Olympic Center pulling out a boat to carry for Ted's mission. They would be competing in the Ocean Inlet event, which would be held the next day. Ted and Bert each grabbed an end of their sculling boat and started carrying it from the Olympic Center and past the refinery and refinery guard station to the Ocean Inlet to practice. Ted's orders were to turn the boat upside down and carry it from the Olympic Center past the refinery guards to the cement factory next to it. They would pretend that they were taking it to the little inlet bay where the sculling competitions were to be held the next day. They would look like they were just going to practice before the event. The guards at the refinery gate knew about the Special Olympics going on, so they would hopefully think nothing about the boys walking the boat in front of them. Ted was a member of Beetle Light, but Bert was just another competitor that trained at Briarwood back home. Bert didn't know anything about Ted being part of a special mission to save Dr. Steingart, and that's just the way Ted wanted to keep it. He needed Bert's help carrying the boat, however, which had something hidden up inside it. That's why the boat was being carried upside down. Up inside the boat, rolled up in a very long duffel bag, was something very important that Ted had to get to the top of the old guard tower above the cement factory next to the refinery. The guard tower was not being used anymore, and it had a long flat roof, which would be very important in helping Jillian and me escape after we fulfilled our mission in the control room. Ted could not tell Bert anything about what was in the duffel bag they were carrying inside the boat, so Bert would act natural as they passed the guard station carrying the boat. If the guards stopped them and searched the boat and found what was in it, they would immediately be arrested. Bert helped carry the boat because Ted was his friend and they rowed together in the U.S. sculling team. The problem was that Ted and Bert had to carry the boat right in front of the main security gate of the refinery where the guards were stationed. The cement factory was right next to the guarded refinery, which was now a sub-base. They were both in their workout clothes and calmly walked in front of the guards, smiled and waved at them. This was the beauty of Beetle Light. Two kids with Down syndrome carrying a boat did not look like any kind of a threat to the guards, and they knew the Special Olympics were going on, so they let them pass, just like in the Trojan horse story. Ted even gave a friendly wave to one of the guards, who waved back, but the other guard was more serious and refused to wave. The undercover Beetle Light idea counted on the view that people have of other people with disabilities. Little did the guards know that Ted was one of the best rowers in the Special Olympics. not to mention an ace photographer. People with Down syndrome are among the most loyal and can be very task-oriented. Once taught a task, they will get it right and do it the same way every time. This is what Major Santos was counting on with Ted. He had a complex task to do, and do perfectly, without the guards finding out. Ted was up to the job. After Ted and Bert had gone past the main gate and the guards, they carried the upside-down boat to the old cement factory that used to load cement onto ships tied up at the dock nearby. This was before it was turned into a submarine base for the Soviet Navy. They stopped and flipped the boat over and set it down. Ted reached inside the boat and pulled out a long duffel bag. Bert asked what was in the duffel bag. Ted told him it was a secret and asked him if he could keep a secret. Bert trusted Ted and said that he could. Ted said, "I have an important mission for you. Stay here and guard this boat. I have to drop this bag off, and then I will come back." Bert said that he would stay with the boat, and he stood guard, not knowing why he had to watch their boat. But he did what Ted asked anyway. Ted, who was very strong from his training, picked up the long bag and put it on his shoulders and started up the flight of stairs that led to the guard tower roof above the cement factory. It was a steep climb, but Ted was in good shape from his conditioning. Ted finally got to the top of the stairs of the guard tower and was able to throw the long bag on top of the roof. He went around and found a ladder leading to the top of the roof and climbed up to where the bag he had just thrown was waiting. Once on the roof, he went over to the bag laying there and unzipped it to reveal long aluminum poles with sailcloth between them. It was a hang glider that could accommodate 2 hand cycles along with the weight of Jillian and me. He had practiced putting this together many times back at the Beetle Light complex at home. He could even do it with his eyes blindfolded in case it had been pitch black that night, which unfortunately was not the case that night. The moon happened to be almost full, but it was dark enough for Ted to put together the hang glider without being seen. There was also enough light coming from the refinery next door, so this was going to be really easy for Ted. He started connecting together all the poles and sailcloth with ease. He had another large silver tube with a wire and a red button attached to it. It had a note on it, and it said, "Do not touch this button." He attached the tube to the bottom of the hang glider he had just put together. The tube had a very small rocket engine in it that would fire for 30 seconds, then burn out. But it would provide enough thrust to get the 2 hand cycles we would be in airborne and off the roof. Ted's mission was to get this hang glider put together and attach the rocket under the glider, then get back to the Olympic Center as fast as possible. It had to be completed and waiting for Jillian and me to escape after we pulled the lever to open the underwater security gate in the control room. After putting the glider together, Ted grabbed the empty duffel bag that the hang glider was in, then hurried back down the stairs where Bert was still standing guard next to the boat. Ted stuffed the empty duffel bag up in the boat. They were ready to get back to the Olympic Center. They were going to have to walk past the guard station again, unfortunately. Ted was hoping the guard was going to be as friendly on the way back as he was the first time. They picked up the boat and headed back to the Olympic Center, past the guards. But this time the guard was suspicious because the boat they were carrying was now right side up as they carried it. The guard motioned for them to come over to the guard station. He said something, but Ted couldn't understand him because he was speaking in Russian. It was clear the guard wanted them to come over to him, so they did. Ted was thinking, I hope he doesn't notice the boat isn't wet, because they were supposed to be practicing in the inlet bay next to the cement factory. There was no turning back now. The guard came over and suspiciously checked out the boat. Ted could feel his heart thumping inside his chest, and thought the guard might be able to hear it because it was thumping so hard. Of all things, the guard reached into the boat and pulled out the long empty duffel bag that the hang glider had been in. When Ted got back down to the boat, he had just stuffed the empty bag under a seat, where he thought no one would find it. Ted was now caught. The guard said in Russian, "What is this?" Bert didn't know what was going on, but Ted was sweating and nervous. The whole mission could be ruined right now unless Ted could figure out some way to convince the guard they were just practicing at the inlet bay and that the bag was used for something innocent. At the last minute, Ted thought quickly and reached into the boat and pulled out the long oars for rowing the boat and put them in the long duffel bag. He then handed the duffel bag with the oars in it to the guard to inspect. The guard was fooled and satisfied with the explanation of the bag being for the oars. The guard then told them to move on. Ted smiled at the guard, as did Bert. Ted was sweating, but Bert still didn't know what was going on and acted natural, which was exactly why Ted didn't tell him what they were doing. Ted's mission was accomplished. The hang glider was in position on the roof and ready for our escape. Ted and Bert got back to the boathouse at the Olympic Center. Ted immediately went over to the workout room, which was the meeting place for everyone once the mission was accomplished. All Ted had to do now was wait and hope that none of the team got caught before they got Dr. Steingart free and reunited with his wife and daughter on the U.S. submarine. Chapter 10. The Dogs Are Coming Up the Pipe. Back where Jillian and I were trying to escape the dogs that were still climbing up the pipe toward us and gaining ground, they were slipping a little on their way up, which was slowing them down a bit, but if we didn't come up with a plan soon, they would reach us and kill both of us. Jillian pulled out her crossbow for a second and then said, "I can stop them with this, but I have Dobermans at home as pets, and I just can't shoot them. Do you have any other ideas?" I told her I didn't, and that we would just have to try to make our way down the pipe to the control room and see what happens. Jillian went to put her crossbow back in her leg, and when she did, the baton she used earlier to whack the spider off me fell out and hit the bottom of the paper-thin pipe below our hand cycle, where we were parked. When her baton hit the bottom of the pipe, it went right through the metal floor like it was tissue paper and made a big hole. After going through the pipe, we could see her baton fall all the way down into the ocean that was below us. Our wheels were safely up on the solid sides of the pipe, but everything under us was rusted so badly a toothpick would have fallen through. This gave me an idea, and I figured out what to do. The dogs were barking ferociously and growling like they wanted to eat us. They were almost up to the top of the bend in the pipe where we were, so we rolled back far enough to get the dogs in the right position over the thin, rusted pipe area where we had just been. Then we started yelling, "Here, boy, come get us!" That seemed to make both dogs even angrier, and they lunged at us, landing on the paper-thin, rusted metal floor of the pipe. They both tore through the paper-thin floor of the pipe and fell to the ocean below. We looked down through the holes they made as they fell through to see two big splashes in the water. The dogs' attitude changed from wanting to kill us to trying to stay afloat and not sink in the ocean. I could see two very wet dogs swimming toward shore, and I remember saying to Jillian that they would have a long, hard swim to cool off before they got back to the beach. As Jillian put away her crossbow, she said, "That was a close one." Then we both breathed a sigh of relief and continued down the pipe toward the control room. It was a straight shot down a long section of pipe, and not having the dogs that wanted to kill us on our tails anymore made the trip a lot more fun than it had been. Now we had to be really quiet because there were guards everywhere down below the control room tower. The tower was about 100 feet in the air. We finally got to the end of the pipe and opened the door slowly to reveal a dark, dusty, and unused control room with levers, valves, dials, and things I had never seen before. We got our hand cycles out of the pipe and onto the floor. I went over to the window and looked down to see the entire refinery. I could clearly see the security areas along with the Soviet submarine that Dr. Steingart was being held captive on. It was tied up at a dock directly below us. There was an old conveyor belt in the room which had not been used in a long time. It went up and out a doorway in the wall of this tiny control room. It continued over to the old cement factory, which was still dark and shut down. The conveyor belt motor wasn't working anymore, and part of my mission was to hook up the motor again, so it would work and give us a way to escape after we completed our mission here. I rolled over to another window and got a better look at where the conveyor belt went. I saw that it went right past another guard tower with a large flat roof above the cement factory. There was a dark hang glider sitting on top of this roof, about 150 feet above where the guards were patrolling on the ground below. They could not see it from where they were in the cement factory. The guards would definitely hear and see this conveyor belt moving out of the control room when I hooked up the wiring to the motor to make it functional again. This would be necessary for our escape. Once on the conveyor belt, we would have to stay in the middle of it so they couldn't see us from below until we got to the other roof with a hang glider on it. It was going to be tricky rolling off the belt onto the tower roof at just the right moment as the conveyor belt passed the roof. Once on the roof, there wouldn't be much time to attach our hand cycles together along with the connecting rods to the hang glider. Then we would push the rocket fire button attached to the hang glider and hopefully launch off the top of the guard tower to escape. We had practiced this many times back at Beetletown. We would then glide across the valley to our landing site, which was in the middle of the soccer field at the Olympic Center. Our orders were to plant a powerful explosive on the hand cycles attached to the hang glider to destroy all the evidence. One more job Ted had to do was to get our wheel racers in the landing zone on the soccer field waiting for us. We were then to transfer to our wheel racers at the landing site and hightail it back to the meeting place in the Olympic Center workout room. Hopefully the other Beetle Light team members would make it back there in one piece as well. Right now our mission was to find the underwater intake gate lever and open it so Justice could swim through the underwater pipe and rescue Dr. Steingart on the Soviet submarine. Everything was written in Russian. I knew what to look for, but I was having trouble finding it. Everything was covered with dust and spider webs, and I couldn't see the names written on anything. I kept wiping everything clean until I finally found the right lever and pulled it to the open position. I hoped it still worked or Justice wasn't getting through the pipe. After I opened the underwater gate, I went to work reconnecting the electrical wires to the motor that would power the conveyor belt, which was probably the easiest thing I did during this whole mission. As an inventor, I was familiar with electronics, motors, and things like that, so this was no problem for me. I quickly hooked up the motor and we were ready for our getaway. Our next job was just to wait until the big diversion that would help cover our escape. Justice would make this diversion when helping Dr. Steingart escape the submarine. So we sat back, watched, and waited for our cue to get on the conveyor belt. Chapter 11. Justice suits up for the dive. At the appointed time, Justice ran over to the shore from the Olympic Center to where the submarine base was. He was using his racing legs and feet combo, which were made of plastic and aircraft aluminum. When he got to the shore, it didn't take him long to find the scuba gear hidden in a black duffel bag. It was stuck in a cove shown on Major Santos's map around the corner from the subbase. Navy SEALs had pre-positioned the scuba gear for him behind a rock. Because Cuba is in the warm Caribbean Ocean, Justice wouldn't need a wetsuit to stay warm, so he would just stay in his workout clothes when diving underwater. He sat down on the shore and changed out his high-tech running feet by turning a ring that clicked into position, allowing him to change to walking-style feet, which would accept scuba fins. He would leave these high-tech running feet here on the beach to use to get back to the Olympic Center after his mission. They would get him back to the center fast, if he made it back here alive. I was glad I wasn't doing this part of the mission. He had to get into a Russian submarine without being seen. Justice pulled out 2 masks and 2 small air tanks. One set was for him, and one was for Dr. Steingart, if he could get him off the submarine without being caught. The most important thing in the duffel bag was the Personal Propulsion Vehicle, or PPV, which divers use to pull themselves fast through the water. However, for someone who doesn't have the use of their legs, it is a great way to scuba dive, like everybody else. It was shaped like a little torpedo that you hold on to, that propels you through the water, but you better have a good grip or it'll take right off on its own out of your hands. Justice got into the water, put Dr. Steingart's mask and air tank in a bag and attached it to his belt. Then he headed for the large underwater intake pipe leading to the refinery and the submarine security area. Justice was hoping that Jillian and I had been successful in pulling the lever that opened the underwater intake gate inside the pipe, so he could freely swim through the pipe. This would get him into the security submarine area, where he would try to find Dr. Steingart and the sub he was being held captive in. At the time, I didn't know that much about Justice, other than everybody liked him, and he was serious about whatever task he was given. He had a sense of honor, and if he liked you, you would have a friend for life. Justice swam to the mouth of the giant water intake pipe and then inside, to find the security gate had been opened. He continued through the pipe to the open area under the submarine. The submarine was gigantic from underneath, and it felt like it took forever to swim to the back of it. This is where he would climb up on it and find the hatch entrance. All of the sailors who normally were on the submarine had liberty, which is what the crew called time off the submarine. There were still 2 guards left inside to guard the sub and Dr. Steingart. Justice had a plan that Major Santos had put together for him, and he was following it exactly. Justice swam to the back of the submarine. There were no guards outside the sub, so he took off his mask and air tank and put them alongside the bag holding Dr. Steingart's mask and air tank. He attached all the scuba gear to the back of the sub at water level. Justice leaned down and turned the ring and changed his feet position from swimming mode back to walking mode, and his feet moved up into position ready to walk. He then quietly crawled up the back of the submarine. Justice quickly got over to the open hatch and stairwell, which led down into the submarine. He looked below to see if there was anyone there. The coast was clear, and he quickly walked down the stairs, which was a little tricky using these high-tech feet that were designed for swimming, not walking on metal stairs. Justice had entered the back of the sub and could see most of the way down the long breezeway. Inside the sub, he couldn't see any guards, but he wasn't sure where Dr. Steingart was, and it was clearly going to take a little time exploring. He slowly moved through the first watertight doorway into the next section of the sub. Inside the submarine was eerie and quiet, except for the hum of the generators that were charging up the batteries of the submarine. There were levers, switches, valves, and everything was labeled in Russian. Justice kept moving deeper into the submarine, checking the small rooms where the sailors would sleep, but he couldn't find the doctor. In one room there was a picture of the Soviet leader on one of the walls, along with Russian food in boxes sitting on a table. This was clearly Russian territory, and if the guards caught Justice, they would kill him on sight for being in their sub. He had to find Dr. Steingart and find him fast. Justice could hear footsteps coming from down the breezeway, headed toward him. It was 2 guards, and their heavy boots were clanking against the metal floor of the submarine. They were coming his way and getting closer. Justice was dripping water marks all over the floor and hoped the guards wouldn't notice, but there was nothing he could do about it at this point. Justice dove into a sailor's room and leaned back against the wall, out of sight. He was trying to be as quiet as possible. The guard stopped for a second and looked into the room where Justice was hiding. He was just a few feet away from the guard's head as he peeked into the room, checking it out. If the guard took one step forward, he would have been able to see Justice up against the wall hiding. Justice had orders to get to the torpedo room and find a torpedo to attach a smoke bomb to for a diversion, so it would look like the torpedo was on fire and was going to blow up the sub. That should panic the guards and get them off the sub so Justice could find Dr. Steingart and help him escape. Right now, Justice just had to hope this curious guard would leave the room and go to the back part of the sub so he could go to the front part where the torpedoes were. The guard finally stepped back into the breezeway and continued on with his comrade toward the back of the sub. Justice slowly moved to the doorway and poked his head out to see the guards moving down toward the back of the sub. Justice then crept toward the front of the sub, looking in rooms as he went down the breezeway, until he heard something in one of the rooms. It sounded like someone slurping something. He slowly poked his head in to see a man in a white shirt drinking a cup of coffee. Justice thought, this must be Boris Steingart. The man looked up to see Justice, who was still a little wet, wearing a dripping running suit, who had clearly just gotten out of the water. When the man drinking the coffee looked over to Justice, he saw a scuba diver who had 2 artificial legs attached to 2 high-tech looking artificial feet. It must have been a very strange sight to this man sitting there. Justice said, "Are you Dr. Boris Steingart?" The man said, "Da," which meant yes in Russian. Justice went on to say, "Do you speak English?" The man said, "Yes." Justice explained that he was working for the United States government and was here to rescue him. Boris was all too ready to go, and jumped up, spilling his cup of coffee on the table. Chapter 12. Let's blow up the torpedoes. Justus and Boris peeked out in the breezeway and then headed forward to the torpedo tubes. The only way to get the guards off the sub was to convince them that one of the torpedoes was on fire and would blow up the submarine and everything around it on the dock. As Boris and Justus made their way down the breezeway, Boris whispered to Justus, "Where are we going?" Justus whispered back, "To blow up the torpedoes." Boris's eyes got really big, and he said, "Oh, I was just wondering." He continued to follow Justus because he trusted that he had a plan. Justus suddenly looked back behind them and could hear the guards coming quickly. The guards had finally noticed the watermarks on the floor, dripping from Justus's running suit and feet. They knew they had an intruder on the submarine, and they started running to the front of the submarine as they followed the watermarks on the floor. Justus said excitedly, "We have to hurry. Here they come." He and Boris ran down the rest of the way to the front of the torpedo room. When they got to the torpedo room, there were 6 torpedo tubes with 1 torpedo already loaded in one of the torpedo tubes and ready to fire. Justus could see the propeller at the back of the torpedo sticking out of the tube. There was another torpedo out in the room that had not been loaded in a tube yet. These were really powerful explosive weapons that, when fired at an enemy ship or submarine, could destroy it completely. The submarine sailors were always careful with torpedoes down in their subs, because there had been many accidents with torpedoes exploding inside submarines, killing everyone inside and sinking the subs. Justus was counting on this level of concern to panic these guards and get them off the sub. The hope was the smoke bomb would create a big enough diversion so he and Boris could get off the sub without being seen. Justus leaned down and pushed a button on one of his artificial legs, and a watertight door popped open on the plastic part of his leg to reveal what looked like a large firecracker. It was a harmless smoke bomb, which would fill the torpedo room with smoke. This would make the guards panic and run off the sub to save their lives, as well as clear the dock area for the explosion they thought was coming. Justus took the smoke bomb that had a magnet glued to the back of it and stuck it on the propeller of the torpedo. He then lit the fuse. The fuse burned down and lit the smoke bomb. A huge cloud of thick smoke started filling the room. Justus and Boris went over and hid behind an electrical panel, but the smoke was so thick the guards, who had finally arrived, couldn't see them through the smoke anyway. The guards were panicked and yelled something in Russian as they ran down the breezeway to the exit at the back of the sub. They quickly ran up the stairs and off the sub, motioning to the guards around the dock to run away, and that the submarine torpedoes were going to blow up the dock area. Back inside the torpedo room, the smoke was getting thick, and Justus and Boris got up from behind the panel where they had been hiding. It was hard to breathe, and they quickly ran out of the torpedo room. They took off down the breezeway to the back of the submarine where the stairs were located, leading out. When they got to the base of the stairs, Justus reached down to the secret compartment in his leg and pulled out a small radio, pushed the transmit button, and said, "Commander, I have the package. We are leaving the sub. Be watching for us at the rendezvous point. Beetle Light, out." Then Justus took the lead and carefully walked up the stairs to peek out the top of the hatch, which was now billowing smoke, to see if the coast was clear. All the guards on shore were so afraid the sub would blow up, they took off to a safe distance, clearing the area. This gave Justus and Boris time, as they slid down the backside of the sub into the water and the waiting scuba gear. Justus put his mask on, adjusted his feet to swim mode, and helped Boris with his mask and air tank. Justus then said to Boris, "Hold on to my fins, and no matter what, don't let go. This PPV will get us to safety and to the American submarine waiting for us." Then he added, "By the way, stay close. There are sharks on the prowl out there. They won't want to take us both on, I hope." Justus could see Boris's eyes were wide open, and he was looking around for sharks now. Justus was more afraid of getting caught by Vlad than any sharks he may swim by. Then they both submerged. Justice pushed the forward button on the PPV, and it took off toward the intake pipe. Boris was holding on to Justice's fins, and they both went back through the intake pipe, the open security gate, and out into open ocean. There were a few sharks, and Justice was keeping an eye on them. He could feel Boris grab his fins harder as the PPV propelled them both through the water toward the meeting point with the U.S. submarine. It was still very dark out, and Justice thought it was safe to surface to see if he could see the American submarine. This is where he was supposed to deposit Boris. They came to the surface, and there was nothing there. Where were they, Justice thought, as they floated there alone. Boris just asked, "They come soon?" Justice nodded and said, "They're supposed to be here. We will just have to wait." So they floated while waiting for the American submarine to emerge and come to the surface. Back up in the refinery control room above, Jillian and I were still waiting for our cue to escape to the waiting hang glider. We finally heard a big commotion below, so I went over to the window and saw smoke coming out of the Russian submarine's stairwell hatch. 2 guards were running and yelling something in Russian. They were motioning for everyone to get back. I looked at Jillian and said, "That's our cue. Let's go." Everyone was in a panic below, running in every direction away from the dock area. I looked down through the window to see 3 big Russian guards. It was Vlad and 2 elite guards that had fired on Boris's wife and daughter's small boat. Then they had caught and dragged Boris off as a captive on the submarine a year ago. Vlad was even scared and had moved away from the submarine and the dock. He was directly below the control room tower where we were waiting to escape. It was a little scary having Vlad, of all people, directly below us next to the tower stairs leading up to us. We rolled our hand cycles onto the conveyor belt, and I said, "Okay, Jillian, do your stuff." Jillian had already pulled her crossbow out of her leg and was taking aim at the red start button across the room. The commotion below and the people yelling and screaming had stirred up a rat that had been taking a nap up on the rafters above us in the control room. The rat scampered down the rafter, but slipped and fell down on Jillian's arm just as she fired her arrow at the button. It made her miss her shot, and her arrow ricocheted off the panel and blew through the control room tower window, sending glass down below our tower. The shattered glass from the window made a loud noise as it fell 100 feet from the tower to the ground below. Some of the glass even fell on Vlad and his 2 guards, who were standing under the tower. One guard was cut by a sharp piece of glass, and they all looked up at the tower above. Vlad started getting suspicious and told one of the guards who wasn't cut by the glass to follow him up the stairs to the control room tower, where we were trying to get our conveyor belt started. I said to Jillian, "That's the first time I've ever seen you miss." Jillian took a little offense to that comment and said, "You did see the size of that rat, right?" I wanted to kid with her a bit and said, "What rat?" Just then the fun was over. Someone was running up the stairs toward us. I whispered, "Someone's coming. Shoot the button. Hurry." Jillian took aim with another arrow and shot again, hitting the button dead center. The conveyor belt took off with us immediately. We headed outside of the control room on the belt leading to the tower above the cement factory. We couldn't look over the belt to see who was coming up the stairs yet, or they would have seen us, but I was pretty sure it was Vlad. We had to get to the other roof and connect to the hang glider fast before Vlad figured out where we were going and who we were. When he got up to the control room, he would be able to see the hang glider that was on top of the cement factory guard tower, and what we were doing there. We needed to be in the glider and flying by that time, or he would have time to shoot us down. As we got farther away from the control room and closer to the cement factory tower roof, I sat up and looked back to see who was coming up the stairs after us. I was not surprised to see that it was indeed Vlad. He was about halfway to the control room when we were almost to our jumping off point. Chapter 13. On the Guard Tower Roof. As the conveyor belt took us slightly above the roof of the guard tower, we both rolled off the belt and crashed down next to the hang glider, which had been set up by Ted earlier. I fell off my hand cycle when I landed on the roof, but Jillian was able to hold on to hers and landed upright. As usual. I crawled back up onto my hand cycle, and we went over to the hang glider. Each of our hand cycles connected to each other, and then the main wing supports under the hang glider. The glider would use our hand cycle wheels to take off and land with. Jeff back at Beetletown was a genius. He had designed this whole thing to work like this. Ted had reassembled it perfectly, just like we practiced back home. This was amazing because our cycles were getting pretty banged up with everything we had gone through, and it was all still fitting together perfectly. All that was left to do was to take the tape that said, "Do not touch this button," off, and push it to fire the rocket that would get us out of here. I was in the pilot's seat and Jillian was locked into the co-pilot position next to me. Now all the endless practicing that I had been doing under Major Santos's supervision was going to pay off. I looked back over to the control tower that we had just come from, and I could see that Vlad had finally gotten to the control room window. He spotted the large hang glider our hand cycles were now attached to. It was dark enough, however, that he was unable to make out the details of who was piloting the glider. Inside the control room, Vlad was trying to figure out what was going on. He could see where we had been and which levers and buttons we had been messing with, because the dust was off the underwater intake gate lever, making the submarine area vulnerable. Vlad suddenly put it all together and knew the only thing of importance in the sub area was Dr. Steingart, and he had all the Soviet Navy secrets. Vlad remembered he had ordered the cannon to fire and kill Boris's wife and daughter, and he knew that if Boris escaped, he would tell all of the secret technologies to Russia's enemies. Worse than that for Vlad, Boris was his responsibility, and if Boris got away, Vlad would have to answer to his commander for his escape, and that would not be good for Vlad. Just then I pushed the rocket fire button, and the rocket lit up the sky as it thrust us forward at high speed and off the top of the guard tower roof. We were in the air and flying. Vlad could see the hang glider clearly now, with the rocket flare coming out of the back of the rocket and us taking off. While looking out the window of the control room, Vlad couldn't make us out. He thought that Boris might be on the hang glider flying to freedom, but he didn't know for sure. Vlad suddenly knew his life might be in danger if Dr. Steingart was on that hang glider. Vlad took off down the stairs toward the submarine dock and ordered one of his men to go inside the smoking Russian submarine. Vlad wanted to check to see where the smoke was coming from and if Boris was still aboard. He thought all of this might be a diversion to aid in Boris's escape, but he personally wasn't going to take the chance that there might be a torpedo really on fire inside the submarine. Vlad had to know if Boris was still on board and if the sub was in danger of exploding before he could do anything else. This gave us a little time to fly across the valley to the landing site at the Olympic Center. Justice and Boris were still floating, where the submarine was supposed to meet them. Boris leaned over to Justice and commented, "Not to be ungrateful for your help, but someone is going to come, right?" Justice turned and looked at him and said, "This is where we're supposed to be. They should be." But before Justice could finish what he was saying, giant bubbles came up from below them, and something the size of a giant black building was slowly rising out of the water next to them. It was the American submarine Justice was waiting for, which had finally arrived. The top hatch popped open, and a rope ladder was thrown down to them in the water. Justice turned to Boris and said, "This is your ride. I hope you have a good life in America." Boris said, "You're not coming?" Justice replied, "No, I have to get back to the Olympic competition to cover your escape." With that, Justice submerged and pointed his PPV back toward the shore. Justice finally got to shore. He heard the guards poking around the bushes near him. They were looking for any clues to what had happened that night. Justice put the air mask, air tank, and PPV in a black duffel bag that was still on the shore and sank them all in deep water. He then clicked the rings on his swim feet back to the run mode feet that they had developed back at the Beetletown lab. He was about to really put them to the test. But he had to wait until just the right moment to make a break for it. The guards were everywhere. Back on the submarine, Boris had climbed down the ladder and was now inside the American sub. He was taken by a crewman to see the captain. The captain came down the breezeway and into the control room of the submarine to meet Boris. He had someone behind him, but Boris could not see who. The captain said, "I am glad you are free, Dr. Steingart. Boris said, "Captain, I am grateful for all your help in my escape. I just wish you had been there to save my dear wife and child." Boris looked very sad and remembered Vlad ordering them to be blown up in their tiny boat while trying to escape. The captain had a funny little grin on his face, which Boris did not understand and thought a little heartless after he had just told him that his wife and daughter had been killed. Boris said to the captain, "Why do you smile at such sad news?" The captain said, "Dr. Steingart, our Navy SEALs can't do everything, but if it's possible, it's a good bet they're going to get the job done. The night the shore cannons were firing at your wife and daughter, some of our Navy SEALs took a raft from this submarine under fire from those cannons and pulled your wife and daughter from the boat." Boris looked at the captain and said, "This is impossible. I saw the boat explode myself." The captain said, "Well, it's time for you to hug the impossible." The captain stepped back to reveal Boris's wife and little daughter in the breezeway behind him. Boris's daughter ran and jumped into her father's arms, and his wife came up to him and they all embraced. Boris was overcome with emotion and said, "Captain, I will forever be in your debt. I think I have information you will find helpful, and I will be more than happy to share it with you." The U.S. captain said, "We will be more than happy to receive your information, but just so you know, we would have saved your wife and daughter without you helping us at all." With that, Boris's daughter grabbed her father's hand and started leading him toward the ship's kitchen. She stopped and looked up at her father and said in Russian, "Daddy, they have the best ice cream you have ever eaten here." They all laughed and continued on to the kitchen, where the ship's cook was holding 3 ice cream cones. Chapter 14. Flying Above the Soccer Field. Jillian and I were flying high in the hang glider in the blackness of the night, but we could see the huge soccer field next to the Olympic Center, which was all lit up. I could see the 2 wheel racers I had invented ahead parked on the field next to our landing site, so I steered the hang glider to land next to them. Jillian and I transferred out of the hang glider and over to the wheel racers. Waiting for us on one of the wheel racers was a very powerful explosive with a timer clock attached. It was intended to destroy the hand cycles and hang glider, allowing us to escape to the workout room where the rest of our team would meet up after the mission. I set the explosive clock to go off in 10 minutes, giving us enough time to get away. This would destroy all evidence of what we did and how we did it. It would also cause a diversion, so we could all get back to the meeting place and act like we were just Special Olympic competitors. I pushed the start button, and the countdown began on the explosive. After setting the bomb on my hand cycle, we pushed as hard as we could toward the Olympic Center. We could see the lights coming from it, and if we could make it without anyone seeing us coming from the soccer field, we would have made a successful mission. The last thing we had to wait for would be Justice. He had to get away and meet us at the workout room to hopefully give us the news we all wanted to hear. We got Dr. Steingart out, and he's free. It was getting late, and Vlad had just gotten the news from the poor sailor that had been forced to go down into the smoky submarine to check and see if Boris had escaped. The word was Boris was gone, and it was just a smoke bomb on the torpedoes. Vlad was furious and grabbed 2 guards and told them to come with him. He was going along the shore with flashlights looking for any clues as he headed toward the direction that the hang glider had flown, which was the Olympic Center. Justice saw Vlad and his 2 guards heading his way. Vlad was still about a football field's length away, but he would ultimately find Justice if he kept coming his direction along the shore. Justice needed a diversion, so the guards would look elsewhere, and he could take off running toward the Olympic Center. He reached down and pushed a button that opened one of his watertight compartments in a leg and pulled out a very small radio-controlled helicopter. He opened the other leg to get the radio-controlled unit for that helicopter. It was dark and the guards were far away, so Justice took the opportunity to fire up the small engine on the helicopter. He quickly grabbed the radio-controlled and pulled the levers to make the small helicopter take off up into the sky. He flew it out over the water far enough away so the guards would not be able to see what it was without a powerful flashlight. As the helicopter's engine started, it made a loud, high-pitched whiny noise. Vlad and his two guards stopped looking through the bushes and started looking along the water's edge. They ran toward where Justice had just started the small helicopter down by the beach, about 100 yards. The guards were a little confused, however, because the sound started by the shore but then moved out over the ocean too far for them to see. They did have a high-powered flashlight, but it was back at the cannon that had shot at Dr. Steingart's wife and daughter in the tiny boat. It would take a little time for one of the guards to run over and get the light. Vlad and the other guards stood on the shore near where the sound was coming from, waiting for the other guard to bring the high-powered light. They were trying to see what was making the strange sound out over the water. All they had were their underpowered little flashlights and could not make out what it was. Jeff and a kid named Sam, who was dealing with cancer back at Beetletown, was an expert at radio-controlled vehicles and had designed a couple of radio controllers for this mission. This controller would not only direct the small chopper where you wanted it to go, it could put the helicopter in hover mode automatically with a flip of a switch. Flipping the switch would allow the operator to leave the controller and let the helicopter hover in a stationary position as a diversion tactic until it ran out of gas. This could cause a diversion as the agent had time to run away, and that's exactly what Justice was going to try to do with it. Justice directed the helicopter way out to sea. It was too far out over the ocean for the guards to see in the dark, but the loud little engine would keep their attention and cover the sound of Justice running. Justice decided to get away while they were busy trying to figure out what the sound was. The helicopter had 5 minutes worth of gas on board to keep flying, and then it would crash into the ocean. While it was hovering, Justice had to make a break for it, while he could. He covered the remote control in the sand, jumped up, and started running toward the Olympic Center as fast as he could. Unexpectedly, after only 3 minutes, the helicopter ran out of gas and crashed into the ocean, but Justice had a good head start. Now that the tiny helicopter engine was not making such a racket, Vlad and the guards could hear Justice running in the distance, and immediately pointed their low-powered flashlight in the direction of someone running away, but could only make out a faint figure in the distance. The problem with the new high-tech feet attached to Justice's aluminum legs was they were made of metal and designed for speed on the Olympic track, but they were loud when the metal feet touched the ground. They were not like tennis shoes, and Vlad could clearly hear Justice running in the distance. He could also hear what direction Justice was running toward. The other guard finally returned with a high-powered flashlight, but the helicopter had crashed and sunk in the ocean, so there was nothing there to see. Vlad was now more interested in this new sound of someone running away, so he grabbed the flashlight from the guard and pointed it in the direction of the sound. He could see what looked like a man trying to escape in the distance. He was too far away to make out any details. Vlad ordered his guards to start the chase, and all 3 men took off after Justice. Vlad knew that if he let Dr. Steingart escape, he would be in big trouble with his Soviet commander, who would show Vlad no mercy. It was clear to him he must catch this mysterious man no matter what. He knew this man was headed for the Olympic Center, and he could easily catch him there, because there was nowhere to hide at the Olympic Center. Justice came around a rock pile, still running at full speed toward the Olympic Center, when a giant explosion and fireball formed off to the side of the soccer field. It knocked Justice off his feet for a second. He got back up and continued on to the meeting place, which was the workout room in the Olympic Center. Vlad was sidetracked from chasing Justice and ran over to the fire to see what was burning. When he got there, everything was gone and blown into a million pieces. The explosive was so powerful that the hand cycles and the hang glider were unrecognizable, just some metal pieces of rubber burning. There was no evidence of anything left for Vlad to inspect. Chapter 15. Olympic Center Workout Room. Justice continued on and made it to the workout room out of breath, where Jillian, Ted, and I were all pretending to work out. We looked like we were getting ready for the next sporting event, and our hearts were beating out of our chests, but not because we were working out, but because we were afraid we would get caught. We all asked at the same time, "Did we get Dr. Steingart out?" Justice, out of breath, said, "Mission accomplished." Then he whispered, Vlad is on his way here with soldiers, and he's really mad. He will be looking for a man that was running from the shore and the submarine base, which was me." Then Justice said, "It's time for the Trojan horse fake-out. Get into positions before he gets here. He will be here soon, and remember, we are just poor disabled athletes competing at these Special Olympics." Everyone understood and got ready. Vlad continued on to the Olympic Center with his guards, and they were mad and determined to find the secret agent or commando they saw running this way. Vlad would show no mercy when he caught up with this mysterious dark figure running toward the Olympic Center. Inside the workout room, Justice ran over and found a weight machine, and quickly took off both his legs and high-tech feet, and hid them under some barbells in the corner. He started pretending to lift weights. Jillian took her leg off and hid it too. She got out of the wheel racer and into a traditional-looking wheelchair that had some special Beetle Light technologies that Sam back at Beetletown lab had put in. I will tell you about that later. Ted went over to the rowing machine to get into position before Vlad got there. Everybody was getting ready, and I pushed my wheel racer over by the barbell table. We were as ready as we could be. It was time to see if we could trick Vlad and the soldiers into thinking that we really weren't the secret agents they were looking for. Just then the door to the workroom burst open, and Vlad and his 2 guards came into the room with guns pointed at everyone. They were very angry and looking for something or someone. We all looked at each other, stopped what we were doing, and innocently looked up at Vlad and the other guards, pretending to be surprised. I looked at Vlad and asked him what he was looking for. He looked around the room and just saw kids with disabilities working out for their next event. One boy who had no legs, and one boy with Down syndrome. One girl with only one leg in a wheelchair, and me, who was in a wheel racer with barbells, and no use of my legs. We all innocently looked at Vlad and the guards. Vlad was mad. Vlad got right in my face and yelled in English, "Did you see a man in black run through here? He's a criminal and we must find him." I looked up at him and could say honestly, "No, I haven't seen any man wearing black." Then I looked at Justice and said, "Hey, Justice, have you seen any man in black running through here?" Justice looked at Vlad and shook his head no. Then Ted, to finish the deception, came over and wrapped his arms around Vlad and gave him a big hug. Ted turned to me so Vlad couldn't see and winked his eye that he had just fooled Vlad. Vlad pushed Ted to the ground. Vlad turned with his guards and left the room, slamming the door behind them as they frantically looked for the man in black they were chasing. After they left, we all came together silently in the middle of the room and did a big high five with each other to celebrate our victory. Then I whispered, "We did it!" Just then Vlad burst back in the door, as if to take one more look. Then he gave us the evil eye as he gazed across each one of us one by one. He couldn't figure out what had happened, but he suspected something. He took a second look at us poor disabled kids and said to himself in Russian, "It is not possible." And then he huffed out the door a second time. Major Santos was right. We were the perfect undercover agents for a mission like this. Any able-bodied agent running to the Olympic Center would have been caught. We had pulled it off and accomplished our mission. Jillian pushed a secret button on her special wheelchair, and a flexible pipe ramp came out from under her chair. On one armrest, a radio controller popped up to control a small remote-controlled car, which came flying out of the ramp. Ted opened the door just enough for the small radio-controlled car to get out the door. The little car was fast and had a small video camera on it, which sent back video to Jillian's chair monitor. On the right armrest of the chair was a small video screen that popped up, and she could see everything the little remote-controlled car could see. Then she could report to us when the coast was really clear and we were out of danger. Jillian directed the car through the doorway and into the flower bed outside the building to see where Vlad was. While Jillian was watching her video screen, she told us everything as it was happening and said, "Hey guys, this big black car just pulled up and it looks like it's a Soviet Army commander or someone important. A bunch of his soldiers got out too. He looks mad at Vlad." A Soviet army officer that the commander sent over to Vlad came back holding Vlad at gunpoint. The commander pointed at Vlad and gestured like he meant, "Send him away." Justice said, "I think Vlad's in trouble for letting Dr. Steingart escape. He's in for it now, boy." The soldiers dragged Vlad off, like Vlad had done to Dr. Boris Steingart. Vlad was screaming, "Niet, niet," which means no, no. We never saw Vlad again. The Beetle Light mission had been a complete success, and it was time to get off this island and go back home to the good old USA and Beetletown. Chapter 16. Back home at our school cafeteria. It was 2 weeks later, and Ted, Justice, Jillian, and I were back in our town of Lightning Bow. We were sitting around in the outdoor cafeteria after school talking about the mission we had just completed, and wondering if there would ever be another mission for us. It was scary at times, but the most fun we had ever had. Right in the middle of our conversation, someone grabbed my wheel razor, swung me around, and grabbed me by my shirt collar. It was Rodney Bass, the school bully, and his friends Norman and Kelly, that liked to dunk weaker kids' heads in school toilets. Rodney said, "I know it was you that took the pictures that were in the papers of me smashing up those stupid lightning bugs. The judge made me pick up trash on the side of the road for 2 weeks because of you, and now you're mine." As the saying goes, timing is everything, as Rodney was about to find out. Rodney had me by the shirt collar when all of a sudden a huge blast of air, followed by the whirling of powerful helicopter blades from 2 large military helicopters, came down over our heads. They were landing right in front of us in the middle of our own schoolyard lawn. One of them had a white American star and the word Marines printed on the side of it, and another one came down right next to the first one and landed on the grass behind it. Rodney was so shocked that he still had me around the neck and forgot to let go as he looked up at these 2 huge flying machines in our schoolyard. It was the most amazing thing to see, and a little scary. Inside the helicopter was one of Major Santos's commanders. He had his Navy SEAL undercover agents with him. They could see Rodney grabbing me by the shirt collar out the window of the helicopter as they landed. Rodney was also in shock to see this heavily armored machine, which had just landed in the schoolyard right in front of us. The door of the helicopter opened, and the helicopter pilot came out first, got into position, and saluted as the general got out of the helicopter and walked past. He was followed by Major Santos's commander and the other soldiers. When Rodney saw the helicopter up close, and the men coming his way, he let go of my neck. I recognized a couple of the soldiers from when Jillian and I were at the Cuban military base before we parachuted out for our mission. One of them gave me a little smile and a wink as he walked toward us with his commander. I waved back. Rodney saw that I knew one of these soldiers, and I could tell he started getting a little nervous after grabbing me around the neck in front of them all. The general and the commander under him, with his soldiers, walked up to us and stopped. He looked directly at Rodney, who was in shock. These men were tall, pure muscle, and meant business. Rodney had no idea what was going on here. We didn't know what was going on either. One of the commander's soldiers went over to Rodney, took him aside, and looked at him face to face. Rodney was just frozen there, scared to death. This soldier could have crushed Rodney with one hand if he had wanted to. He looked Rodney in the eye and said very calmly, "We always take care of our own and leave no man behind. Now we can see you're messing with people on our team, and that concerns us." Rodney didn't have a clue as to what he was talking about, and he said in a meek little voice, "Who am I messing with on your team?" The soldier, while still pointing at Rodney's face, looked directly at me and asked, "Mr. Richards, what should we do with this bully?" I saw where this was going, and I said, "Sir, I think Rodney there likes putting people's heads in toilets. Maybe he would like to see what it feels like." Ted, who had been a victim of Rodney and his friends many times before, yelled, "Yeah, the toilet!" Rodney was scared to death at what might happen to him now that these Marines were here to protect all his past victims. Then I realized we didn't want to be like Rodney, and I let him off the hook and said, "Just kidding. He's just a bully. Let him go." The Marine looked back at me and said, "Yes, sir," as the soldier stepped back out of Rodney's face. Rodney looked relieved, but the soldier wasn't finished with him yet, and gave Rodney a final warning. "If I get word that you've been a problem to any one of our team here, I will come back and be a personal problem to you. Do you understand me, son?" Rodney was shaking, too scared to say anything, and just nodded yes, he understood. Then he and his friends ran off. We all could hear Rodney crying like a little 2-year-old in the distance as he ran home with his 2 friends. Our team was not allowed to tell anyone we were part of Beetle Light, or that we had access to Beetletown, because it would blow our cover story. When the Marines came, other kids at our school just thought we were volunteering for some kind of experiment with the Marines or something, and never thought another thing about it. They all thought we were pretty cool, though, and I have to admit, that was kind of fun for all of us. The funny thing was, Rodney never knew who worked with the Marines and who didn't, so all bullying stopped at our school. And he never picked on another kid again, thanks to the U.S. Marines. An honor guard of 7 soldiers came over with Major Santos's commander. The commander stopped next to each one of us to thank us personally, as the general was in the background looking on. He gave us his hand to shake and said, "It is an honor to have such talented and dedicated members of our team." He also told us that he was impressed with how well we had accomplished our mission. The information that Dr. Steingart has given us about the Soviet submarine program has been invaluable to the security of our country. You have all done well. It was so cool that I wish my parents could have been there, but this was between us and the Navy Department. Ted was so busy taking pictures of the whole event that I was afraid he was going to miss it. I could see someone in a wheelchair in the background behind the general, watching the honor we were being given. It was Major Santos. He was happy that we were able to finish what he had started, and making his rescue plan a reality. He had already been congratulated by his commander and the general, but he wanted to see us get recognized for our work as well. He just smiled and nodded. I could tell he was proud of all of us. After the ceremony, all of the soldiers and the commander marched orderly back and got in the 2 helicopters. The general headed back for his helicopter too, but just before he got in, he turned and snapped to attention, looking straight at us, and said, "Beetle Light has been deemed important enough to be a permanent Special Operations Division, and will be called upon for future missions." We were all just stunned and excited by the prospect of another mission. The general went on to say, "You will be hearing from us again. Well done, soldiers." And with that he saluted us and got back in his helicopter and took off. We were all speechless and stunned at what had just happened in our tiny town and on our own school football field. Ted was happily taking pictures as the helicopters flew into the blue sky. We looked at each other and said, "Now what?" It wasn't long before some of us at Beetle Light would literally be knee-deep in another adventure. This time it would be one of our own making. Jillian Raintree had an unexpected tragedy and amazing news at the same time that some of the Beetle Light team would be pulled into. The next story was told to me by Jillian, and it's an amazing one. Look for Beetle Light Journal number 4, Legend of the Royal James.